Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We are so glad you're here with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
Of course. And if you are anything like me, you are constantly looking for those massive aha moments.
Right.
You know the ones. The kind of insights that completely shift how you view the world around you. But you definitely do not want the overwhelming fatigue that comes with, like, a massive information overload.
Nobody wants that.
No, exactly. You want the signal, not the noise. And today, we have a signal that is flashing bright red.
It really is.
We are digging into a fascinating, highly provocative piece of source material. It's the transcript from a Vice Vault YouTube video titled How Jeffrey Epstein and the Elite Gained and Retained Power While the Rest of Us Die.
It is a profound piece of media, honestly, and the arguments it presents are incredibly sweeping in their scope. It's attempting to answer some very big, very uncomfortable questions about how modern society actually functions.
Absolutely. The entire mission of our deep dives today is to deconstruct this video's central argument. And that argument is essentially this. Over the last several decades, a sort of shadow architecture composed of powerful corporate elites has spent trillions of dollars to quietly rig the American economic and political system entirely for their own benefit.
Right.
And the kicker, the rest of the public is left to absorb the massive costs of that rigging.
Now, before we take a single step further into this material, we need to establish a very clear, very crucial boundary for you, our listener.
Yes, very important.
This source material wades into some highly charged political waters. It mentions prominent political figures, massive corporations, billionaires, and policies that span the entire political spectrum.
Yeah.
We are going to be talking about figures on the political right, figures on the political left, and everyone in between.
Yes, and this is so important to state right up front. We are not taking sides.
Never.
We never do. Our mission is purely analytical. We are unpacking the architecture of the arguments presented in this specific source text. We are not endorsing these views, and we are not here to condemn any individuals mentioned. We just want you to understand the landscape being described by the creators of this video. Nothing more and nothing less.
Precisely. We are impartial tour guides through this document. Our job is to report on the arguments and ideas exactly as they are presented so you can evaluate them for yourself.
So with that firmly established, let's look at the journey ahead of us. We're going to start by looking at something the source calls the secretive wealth defense industry and the bizarre, labyrinthine mechanisms of tax loopholes.
It's a maze.
It really is. And from there, we'll trace the history back to the 1970s and 80s to examine a massive shift in corporate culture and political strategy.
It was just fascinating.
Totally. And finally, we will land in Detroit, Michigan to see the physical, real-world consequences of these highly abstract economic theories. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with the strange, enigmatic figure of Jeffrey Epstein.
He is the primary entry point the documentary uses to explain a much larger systemic issue. The public narrative around Epstein has, for years, been shrouded in mystery, specifically regarding his finances. The source material asks a very logical question that often gets completely lost in the sensationalism of his crimes.
Right, because there's this glaring contradiction. How does someone who started as a high school math teacher,
Right.
someone who actually lied about his degree, got fired for poor performance, and then got fired again from a low-level job at an investment firm?
Makes no sense.
Exactly.
Yeah.
How does that exact guy become a billionaire who is suddenly hobnobbing with global elites, Middle Eastern sheiks, top intellectuals, and the most powerful businessmen in the country?
It's the central enigma of his rise to power. People have speculated endlessly. Was he an intelligence asset? Was he solely using blackmail gathered from his horrific sex trafficking operations to extract wealth?
But the source presents a different theory.
It does. According to the arguments laid out here, Epstein's real value to the mega-rich, the thing that gave him a Svengali-like hold over them, wasn't just the dark secrets he kept.
Right.
It was that he supplied them with an unparalleled ability to avoid paying their fair share of taxes.
He was the guy who could make billions of dollars legally, or I guess quasi-legally, disappear from the view of the IRS.
Exactly.
And the text gives us a very specific case study to illustrate this mechanism. It brings up Leon Black, the controversial CEO of a massive Wall Street investment firm, a guy with a net worth of over $9 billion.
Right.
The documentary highlights that Black paid Epstein a staggering sum of money, Yeah. $158 million.
And this is where the math really becomes the story. To the average person listening to this, paying someone a $158 million fee sounds incomprehensible.
That sounds like extortion.
It really does. But the text frames this not as a simple fee, but as a highly calculated return on investment. Black paid Epstein $158 million in order to save $2 billion in taxes.
Wow. When you look at it through that lens, paying $158 million to save $2 billion is, in the ruthless logic of Wall Street, an incredibly good investment.
It's a massive return.
It's huge, but it raises the obvious question. How exactly do you make $2 billion in tax obligations vanish?
The video throws out this term, a grantor retained annuity trust, or a GRIT.
Okay, now, I consider myself fairly financially literate, but that sounds like another language. How does a GRET actually work?
It is entirely designed to sound like another language. The complexity is the point. But let's break down the GRET using a simple analogy from the concepts in the text. Imagine you have a seed, and you know this seed is going to grow into an incredibly valuable, massive apple tree.
Okay.
Under normal tax laws, when you pass that massive tree on to your children, they would have to pay a huge estate tax based on the value of the fully grown tree.
Which, if it's $1 billion tree, would be a massive tax bill.
Exactly. So instead, you put that seed into a special, legally protected greenhouse. That is the trust.
Got it.
You pay a small amount of tax on the value of the seed today. The seed grows into a massive tree inside the greenhouse. After a set number of years, the greenhouse legally transfers ownership to your kids. Because you already paid the tax on the seed, the massive growth of the tree happens entirely tax-free.
That is wild.
The documentary argues that billionaires use GRETs to transfer billions of dollars in stock and assets to their heirs without paying a dime in estate taxes.
So you lock in the value when it's low, let it explode in value inside the trust, and the IRS can't touch the growth.
Precisely.
And what I find so darkly fascinating about this whole ecosystem is the branding. These incredibly destructive financial schemes have these cute, almost whimsical names.
They do.
It's not called the Billionaire Wealth Extraction Protocol. It's called things like the Double Irish with a Dutch Sandwich. I mean, it sounds like something you'd order at a deli.
Wow.
Walk me through how this sandwich actually functions.
I will do my best to untangle it because the supply chain of this scheme is a masterpiece of legal evasion. Let's say you have a massive American tech corporation.
Okay.
They have highly valuable intellectual property, patents, search algorithms, software. Step one, the corporation transfers the legal ownership of that intellectual property to a newly created subsidiary company located in Ireland.
So the IP is technically Irish on paper.
Right. But here's the trick. That Irish subsidiary is actually managed and controlled by people sitting in a different location entirely, like Bermuda.
Wait, why Bermuda?
Because Bermuda has no corporate income tax. But you can't just send the money straight there. The IRS would catch that. So step two, that first Irish company licenses the intellectual property to a second Irish company, which is actually operating in Ireland, making the sales.
Okay, I'm fine.
Step three, that second Irish company then sends all the profits, disguised as royalties, to a third subsidiary located in the Netherlands.
The Dutch sandwich part. So we've gone from America to Ireland to a second Irish company to the Netherlands.
Exactly. The Netherlands has very specific tax treaties that allow money to move out of the country without being taxed. And then the final step.
Yeah.
The Netherlands subsidiary funnels all of that money straight to the Bermuda management company. The money effectively vanishes from the American tax system and lands in an offshore tax haven on a beach where the IRS has zero jurisdiction.
It's a complete shell game. You transfer it here, license it there, wash it through the Netherlands, and park it on a beach.
And the vital point the video makes here is that someone like Leon Black pays someone like Jeffrey Epstein because navigating that specific labyrinth is incredibly lucrative.
Right.
Epstein wasn't a lone genius inventing these things from scratch. He was just one high-profile node in a vast pre-existing ecosystem.
And that ecosystem has a name provided by a very interesting figure featured in the documentary, Chuck Collins.
Yes, Chuck Collins. That name might sound familiar to you because he is the great-grandson of Oscar Mayer, like the Bologna Empire.
Yeah, he grew up squarely in the wealthiest 1%, the beneficiary of a massively successful family meatpacking business. But the documentary tells us that in his 20s, Collins made a radical decision.
A very radical decision.
He looked at the system of dynastic inherited wealth, and he decided he did not want to benefit from it. He essentially gave away his inheritance.
And by stepping outside of it, he gained this incredibly clear insider's view into how the machinery actually operates.
He became a class trader in the most fascinating, informative way possible. And it gives us this brilliant term for what we're talking about, the wealth defense industry.
It's a perfect encapsulation.
Yeah.
The wealth defense industry, according to Collins, is an entire army of professionals. We're talking about tax attorneys, wealth managers, accountants, fixers, lobbyists.
Financial butlers.
Exactly. They are the financial butlers to the super rich. Their entire professional existence, and they are paid millions of dollars a year to do this, is dedicated to hiding trillions of dollars.
They are the enablers. They build the Dutch sandwiches. And the key takeaway for you listening right now is this massive contradiction. It is not that the wealthy refuse to spend money.
Not at all.
They are more than happy to spend tens of millions of dollars on this army of lawyers and wealth managers. They just refuse to pay the federal government.
Which is a crucial distinction.
It is. The underlying philosophy, as the text implies, is that the rest of society, the working and middle class, should bear the burden of funding the country's infrastructure, its military, its schools, so the elite don't have to.
Which leads us directly into a very natural question. What happens when the government actually tries to fight back against this wealth defense industry? Because surely the IRS understands these loopholes exist.
You would think the IRS wouldn't just take this lying down. And according to the source material, in the early 2000s, they didn't. The IRS realized they were completely outgunned by these elite armies of tax attorneys. So they tried to form what the video describes as an IRS SEAL Team 6.
The concept was to create a highly elite unit of specialized forensic auditors. Their sole mission was to go after the super wealthy, to untangle the grats and the offshore shell companies, and to bring those hidden trillions back into the tax base.
So how did the super wealthy react to this new elite squad coming for their money? Did they just hire more accountants?
They did something much more aggressive. They executed a political counterattack. The documentary states that the wealthy moved very quickly to disarm this new IRS unit, but they didn't just fight them in tax court.
What did they do?
They used their immense political power, their friends and funded allies in government to go after the funding of the IRS itself.
They essentially defunded the financial police.
Exactly.
The text says the oversight capacity of the IRS to look into the super rich has been absolutely decimated over the last decade or two. Their budgets were slashed, their specialized teams were disbanded.
And this leads to a statistic in the source that is honestly hard to stomach. Think about your own taxes for a second.
Yeah.
The documentary points out that you are 4 times more likely to be audited by the IRS if you claim the earned income tax credit than if you are a super rich person.
Let's clarify what the Earned Income Tax Credit, or EITC, actually is. It's a tax provision specifically meant to help low to moderate income working individuals and couples.
Yeah.
We are talking about people making maybe $30,000 or $40,000 a year.
Yet they are facing audits at 4 times the rate of a billionaire.
It's absurd.
And the text drills down even further into the demographics of this disparity. When you look at who is actually getting audited for claiming the EITC, the IRS is heavily targeting claimants in the American South. The video notes that more than 50% of Black Americans live in the South.
So the burden of these audits is falling heavily and disproportionately on low-income, often minority households.
Yes.
And the obvious question is why? Why spend federal resources going after a single mother making $35,000 a year for a potential $500 discrepancy instead of going after a billionaire hiding $2 billion?
The documentary provides the brutal, pragmatic answer. Because it's easier.
Yeah.
The typical low-income worker claiming the EITC does not have a plethora of aggressive tax attorneys on retainer. They don't have a wealth defense industry protecting them.
No.
To a defunded, overworked IRS, they are an easy mark. They simply don't have the resources to fight a prolonged, multi-year legal battle against the federal government, unlike the billionaires who successfully dismantled the IRS's ability to audit them in the first place.
What's fascinating here is how the source material transitions from the theoretical concept of tax avoidance to hard, irrefutable data. For years, the public had a cynical, jaded sense that the ultra-wealthy were getting away with paying nothing.
Right, but tax information in the United States is highly guarded. Nobody outside the IRS had the actual math.
Until recently.
Exactly. That changed dramatically in 2021.
The ProPublica leaks. This was a massive bombshell. The investigative journalism group ProPublica somehow obtained 15 years of actual internal tax records for the absolute wealthiest individuals in the United States.
And the numbers they revealed, which are cited heavily in this Vice video, completely shattered any lingering illusion of a fair tax system.
Let's look at the specific data points the documentary highlights from those leaks. And again, as a reminder to you, our listener, we are strictly reporting the findings of the ProPublica data as presented in our source material. We take no sides.
Understood. The text points out that Elon Musk, who frequently trades places as the richest person on the planet, paid zero in federal income taxes in 2018.
Zero.
Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, paid zero federal income taxes in 2 recent years, 2007 and 2011.
Michael Bloomberg paid zero. George Soros paid zero. We are talking about individuals with wealth that literally rivals the gross domestic product of small nations, and they managed to get their federal tax bill down to a flat zero.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it fundamentally changes the entire political conversation around taxation. The documentary argues that the constant bitter debates in Washington about raising the tax rate on the top 0.1% are entirely missing the point. It calls these debates a non sequitur.
Right, because if the rate is 35% or 39% or even 70%, it fundamentally does not matter if your taxable income is legally maneuvered to be zero.
39% of zero is still zero.
Exactly. The text says the super wealthy might as well be living in outer space, completely disconnected from the tax systems that govern Earthlings. But that brings up a really practical question, one that I think anyone listening would immediately ask.
How do they buy things?
Yes. If these billionaires are paying zero income tax, how do they actually buy things? How do you buy a $500 million mega yacht or a private jet or an island if you don't have an income to spend?
The video outlines a very specific, highly effective 3-step strategy utilized by the ultra-wealthy, often summarized by economists as buy, borrow, die.
Okay, let's really unpack that. Buy, borrow, die. How does step 1, buy, work?
Step 1, buy, or perhaps more accurately, hold. If you are super wealthy, let's say you are the founder of a massive tech company, you get to decide what your income is.
Right.
You simply choose not to pay yourself a traditional salary, or you take a salary of $1. Instead, your immense wealth remains tied up in the stock of your company. You sit on this mountain of wealth as it appreciates in value over time. You don't sell the stock because the moment you sell it, you trigger a capital gains tax. You just let it grow on paper.
Okay, so the wealth is locked up. You are a billionaire on paper, but you have no cash in your checking account. That brings us to step 2. Borrow. This is the magic trick, isn't it?
It is the fulcrum of the entire strategy. Instead of selling stock to get cash to buy that mega yacht, you go to a major bank and you borrow the money.
Okay.
You take out a massive loan and you use your billions of dollars in stock as collateral to guarantee the loan. The banks are thrilled to do this because the collateral is rock solid, so they offer incredibly low interest rates.
But wait, how does a loan help them avoid taxes?
Yeah.
If you have millions of dollars deposited into your account to buy a yacht, doesn't the IRS want a cut of that?
No, and that is the genius of the loophole. Under the U.S. tax code, a loan is not considered income.
Oh, man.
You do not pay income tax on borrowed money because theoretically you have to pay it back. For the rest of us, as the documentary notes, borrowing means going into stressful debt. Credit card debt, student loans, a mortgage.
Right.
But for the uber rich, taking out a multi-million-dollar loan against a billion-dollar asset is a strategic way to sequester their wealth from the IRS. They get the liquid cash they need to live lavishly, but on paper, they've actually taken on debt, which lowers their taxable profile even further.
It is breathtaking in its audacity. You live like a king on borrowed money, and you pay zero income tax. But eventually, you do have to pay the piper, right?
Which brings us to step 3. Die.
Yes. Step 3. They live on untaxed borrowed money their entire lives. When they finally pass away, the assets, that massive mountain of stock, are passed on to their heirs.
Right.
The documentary notes that at the end of life, through various complex trusts like the GIRO we discussed earlier, they can largely avoid the estate tax. But there is another mechanism here that makes it truly untouchable, known as the stepped-up basis.
Okay, we need an ELI 5 on the stepped-up basis. Explain it like I'm 5.
Let's say you buy a rare vintage comic book for $10. Over your lifetime, that comic book becomes incredibly valuable. When you are old, it's worth $1 million. If you sell it while you are alive, you have to pay a capital gains tax on the $999,990 of profit you made.
Makes sense. You made a profit, you pay tax on the profit. Exactly. But let's say you don't sell it, you hold on to it, and then you die. Your child inherits the comic book. Under the stepped-up basis loophole, the IRS magically resets the original purchase price of that comic book.
What do you mean resets?
For tax purposes, the IRS pretends your child bought it for the current market value of $1 million.
Wait, so the original $10 purchase price is just erased from history?
Yes. So if your child turns around and sells that comic book the very next day for $1 million, their legal profit is zero. They pay zero capital gains tax. The tax on that entire lifetime of growth simply vanishes into thin air.
That is staggering. Buy, borrow, die. It is an entirely different set of financial physics for the top 0.1%. But the documentary makes sure to point out that it's not just individuals utilizing these mechanisms. It pivots here to look at corporations.
Right.
It states that in 2020, 55 of the richest corporations in America also got away with paying zero in federal income taxes.
And this is where the concept of corporate externalization comes into play. It's a slightly academic term, but the video uses a very relatable, everyday example to explain it. McDonald's.
Yes, the McDonald's analogy is so clarifying. The documentary says we might look at the menu at the drive-thru and think, wow, this is a really cheap hamburger. But there is a massive hidden cost to that hamburger.
Absolutely.
We are actually subsidizing those cheap prices because we, the public, are paying for the massive infrastructure, the interstate highways, the local roads, the bridges that McDonald's giant supply trucks use every single day to create their fast food empire.
Those heavy trucks cause massive wear and tear on the public roads. But the corporation utilizes the wealth defense industry to pay as little tax as possible, effectively avoiding paying for the upkeep of the roads they are destroying. The documentary argues that this is the core operational philosophy of every major modern corporation. They look at whatever is going to cost them money, infrastructure, employee healthcare, environmental cleanup, and they figure out how to externalize that cost onto the public sector.
They keep the profits strictly internal for the shareholders and push the costs strictly external onto the taxpayers. And what's the result for us, the public, who are catching those externalized costs?
It's a bleak picture.
The text paints a very grim picture. It says we end up living in a world with crumbling infrastructure, defunded social services, and a government constantly teetering on the edge of a shutdown, unable to pay for basic medical care or education.
Right.
Because, as the source bluntly states, the government has no magical money tree of its own. It only has what it takes in taxes. If the biggest, most profitable entities in the country aren't paying into the system slowly collapses, and the entire burden falls squarely on the middle and working class.
This raises an important question, and it's one the documentary explicitly asks its viewers. How did we get here? How did the American public become convinced that bankrupting our own government while allowing infrastructure to crumble and the costs of basic needs to explode was somehow a good idea? How do you convince a population to vote against its own best interests?
Here's where it gets really interesting. To explain how we got here, the video takes a bizarre, almost surreal detour into the realm of behavioral psychology. It brings up something called Project Pigeon.
It is a fascinating, if slightly unsettling analogy. The text references B.F. Skinner, one of the most famous behavioral psychologists of the 20th century. During World War II, the Pentagon was looking for unconventional weapons, and they hired Skinner for a highly unusual, top-secret experiment.
The military literally wanted him to create pigeon-guided missiles. It sounds completely insane, like something out of a comic book.
It really does.
But they wanted to see if they could train a pigeon sitting inside the nose cone of a missile to peck at a target on a screen. And the mechanism was designed so that the pigeon's pecking would physically steer the missile toward an enemy ship.
To achieve this, Skinner had to figure out how to perfectly control the behavior of the birds. He built what became known as Skinner boxes, or operant conditioning chambers. He would put the pigeons inside, and there would be a screen with different signs or patterns. The pigeons had to learn to peck the specific correct sign. When they did, a small pellet of food would drop into the box.
A system of pure, unadulterated stimulus and reward. And what Skinner proved, as the text notes, is that very quickly, this system of reinforcement would totally condition the pigeons. Even these stupid creatures, as the video bluntly calls them, could learn exactly which buttons they needed to push and which ones to avoid to get the sustenance they needed to survive. The food controlled their every action.
And the documentary connects this historical, slightly absurd military experiment directly to the modern halls of Washington, D.C.
The pivot here is wild.
The central argument here is that the United States Congress has been engineered to function exactly like a Skinner box.
Yes, when you hear the analogy, it clicks instantly. Just like the pigeons learned which buttons to push to get food, politicians learn exactly which buttons to push to get the sustenance they need to survive. And what is the absolute lifeblood, the essential food, that keeps a modern American politician alive in office?
Campaign money. The documentary states a statistic that should stop anyone in their tracks. A member of the United States Congress spends anywhere between 30% to 70% of their working time raising campaign money.
I really want you to imagine that for a second. You are elected to run the country, to solve crises, to read complex legislation, and instead you spend up to 70% of your working hours sitting in a call center across the street from the Capitol, essentially begging for money.
And here is the crucial detail the source points out. They are not raising this money by calling average, everyday Americans. They are raising it from a tiny, microscopic fraction of the 1%.
This creates a profound systemic chilling effect on legislation. The text explains that these mega donors, the billionaires and corporate PACs, become the conditioned reinforcers. They exert a massive invisible gravity over the behavior of the politicians in the box.
Because if that tiny fraction of the 1% objects to an issue, and the video specifically cites major public concerns that routinely poll with massive majority support, like common sense gun safety legislation, healthcare reform, or raising the federal minimum wage, it simply doesn't matter how popular it is with the average voter.
Right.
If the funders in the Skinner box oppose it, the text says flatly, it is not going to happen. The pigeon will not peck that button, because doing so means the food stops.
The video summarizes this entire dynamic with an old, painfully accurate proverb. He who pays the piper calls the tune.
Exactly.
The pigeons peck the button, the mega donors dispense the cash, and the legislation is written. But the video asks another critical question. How did this specific Skinner box get built? When did the rich and powerful realize they needed to steer the government this aggressively? Because it wasn't always like this.
No, it wasn't.
To answer that, the deep dive takes us back in time to a very specific era, the 1970s.
The 1970s was a period of immense social, cultural, and political upheaval in America. The text sets the scene for us. The Vietnam War is raging, protests are filling the streets, the Watergate scandal shatters trust in the presidency. But importantly, alongside all of this, there is a rapidly rising, highly effective movement of consumer protection.
The public was waking up to corporate abuses, and they were angry. The video mentions flagrant everyday issues that people were dealing with. Hot dogs being sold that were made of substandard, dangerous meat, or companies selling toothpaste that didn't actually prevent cavities, but was marketed as if it did.
Right.
And it highlights a young lawyer named Ralph Nader, who was taking on the massive, untouchable car companies. He published Unsafe at Any Speed and testified before Congress that these corporations were knowingly profiting at the expense of people's lives by refusing to install basic safety features.
Alongside this consumer movement, you have a massive rising environmental movement. Rivers are catching fire due to pollution, and the government at that time was actually responding to the public's demands.
Which seems so foreign now.
It does. The text notes that it was actually President Richard Nixon, a Republican, who created the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. Congress passes the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. Governmental agencies are stepping in and, for the first time in a major way, imposing strict health, safety, and environmental regulations on big business.
And how did corporate America react to suddenly being told what to do by the government?
Yeah.
The text says the corporate captains, who had been making tons of money for decades and feeling like they essentially ruled society unchecked, were thrown completely back on their heels.
They panicked.
They felt genuinely under attack. They felt like capitalism itself was teetering on the edge. Enter a man named Lewis F. Powell.
Lewis Powell was a highly influential, highly connected Virginia lawyer. He represented major corporations, particularly big tobacco companies. He would later go on to be appointed as a Supreme Court justice by Richard Nixon. But in 1971, he wrote a confidential memorandum for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And the documentary argues that this single document changed the entire course of American history. It became known as the Powell memo.
The video describes people today being amazed when they finally hear about this document, because it literally sounds like something out of a fictional, paranoid political thriller. What did the Powell memo actually say?
It was part warning, part battle plan. Powell argued with genuine alarm that corporate America was under an unprecedented, coordinated attack from populist regulation, consumer advocates, and liberal voices on college campuses.
Okay.
He believed that the corporate elite was rapidly losing its grip on the levers of power. He wrote that everybody from Ralph Nader to the communist sympathizers were freaking out the corporate elite. His underlying message was stark and urgent. If business doesn't organize to defend itself immediately, the free enterprise system and America as they knew it was going to disappear.
So he essentially drafted a blueprint for a counter-revolution. He warned that the political right and corporate leaders needed to launch a massive, highly coordinated shadow campaign.
Yes.
The goal wasn't just to win the next presidential election. It was much deeper than that. Powell argued they needed to fundamentally influence academia by funding conservative scholars. They needed to sway the judicial courts by pushing corporate-friendly judges, and they needed to fight back against critical voices in the media.
And while the memo laid the intellectual groundwork, the economic conditions of the late 1970s provided the perfect fertile ground for Powell's strategy to actually take root with the public. The text points to the devastating economic phenomenon of stagflation.
Right, stagflation. It's the worst of both worlds. You have skyrocketing inflation, the price of gas and groceries is going through the roof, combined with slow economic growth and high unemployment. Millions of average Americans were struggling to pay their bills more than they had in a generation.
When people are hurting financially, they look for someone to blame. And the text notes that suddenly, Americans became very receptive to the narrative being pushed by this new corporate shadow campaign.
The idea that big government was the problem.
Exactly, that big government and overregulation were the true enemies causing their economic pain. This set the stage perfectly for the 1980 election, specifically referencing Ronald Reagan's famous paradigm-shifting rhetoric. Reagan told the public that inflation existed not because the average worker was living too well, but because government is living too well.
However, the documentary introduces a pivot point here that is incredibly fascinating and arguably even more significant to our current situation than Reagan's election.
Yes.
It focuses on a political campaign that went almost completely unnoticed by the mainstream at the time. The Libertarian Party's 1980 presidential campaign.
And specifically, it focuses on the vice presidential candidate on that ticket, a relatively little-known businessman from Kansas named David Koch, who was operating alongside his brother, Charles Koch, in the background.
The Koch brothers.
The men who would become the infamous Koch brothers.
The text highlights that the Koch brothers were actually running from the right of Ronald Reagan. To them, Reagan was too much of a moderate, too much of a liberal sellout.
Right.
Their platform wasn't just about tweaking tax rates. It was a radical, extreme, anti-government ideology. They wanted to end the federal minimum wage entirely. They wanted to cancel massively popular foundational social programs like Medicare and Social Security. They basically wanted to dismantle the entire New Deal.
And what was the public's reaction to this platform? The text says it was a super flop. David Koch spent roughly $2 million of his own money, a huge sum in 1980, and they received a tiny, statistically insignificant percentage of the vote.
Yeah, nobody wanted it.
The American voters overwhelmingly, decisively rejected their ideals. But instead of giving up and going home, the documentary says the Koch brothers took away a very different, very calculated lesson.
They realized that their ideas were simply too unpopular to ever win in a pure democratic process. As the video bluntly states, they couldn't win the votes of the people, so they decided they needed to own the politicians instead.
A complete pivot.
They shifted their strategy entirely away from grassroots campaigning and toward elite manipulation.
And they used the tax code itself to fund this shift. The text explains that the Kochs and other wealthy families had been using philanthropic donations to charities to avoid taxes for years. They realized they could create their own private ideological foundations, effectively turning them into tax-free treasury chests for their own political projects.
They poured hundreds of millions of dollars into conservative think tanks, legal societies, and political organizations, pushing their extraordinarily right-wing, anti-regulation beliefs into the mainstream without having put their name on a ballot. But the text singles out one specific organization as perhaps the most effective, insidious tool in their entire arsenal.
ALEC.
ALEC. It stands for the American Legislative Exchange Council. It sounds like a friendly guy at the office. Hey, ask ALEC to look at that paperwork. Or it sounds like a boring, neutral government agency.
It does.
But the text reveals it to be a highly coordinated, incredibly conservative, corporate-funded organization that operates almost entirely out of the public eye at the state level.
The video breaks down exactly how ALEC functions as a legalized pay-to-play system for massive corporations. It's brilliant in its efficiency. Let's walk through their workflow with a hypothetical example based on the source's arguments.
Okay, let's hear it.
Say a major national credit card company wants to change state laws to make it much easier for their aggressive collection agencies to garnish wages or go after people with bad debts.
Normally, if a corporation wanted to do that, they would have to hire expensive lobbyists in all 50 states. They would have to publicly testify at state houses, fight local consumer protection groups, and try to get highly unpopular laws passed one by one. It's expensive, time-consuming, and highly visible to angry voters.
Exactly. It's a logistical nightmare. But with ALEC, they bypass all of that. The corporation simply pays a hefty membership fee to join the organization, and they get a seat on a private legislative task force.
Wow.
Behind closed doors at a luxury resort, the corporation's own lawyers literally sit down with conservative state lawmakers and help write the specific language of the bill they want.
They write their own laws? And then what?
Then, ALEC acts as the ultimate distribution network. They transmit that pre-written, highly polished, corporate-friendly bill directly to conservative members in state legislatures all across the country simultaneously.
The politicians get a ready-made piece of legislation to introduce, making them look productive. And the corporation gets the laws changed in their favor across dozens of states, largely without the public ever knowing where the bill actually came from.
It's remarkably efficient.
The documentary uses a deeply haunting analogy to describe this dynamic. It says we are all raised with this beautiful civic idea that we, the people, are driving the bus of democracy. We vote, we turn the steering wheel, and the country responds. But it turns out the steering wheel is entirely disconnected from the wheels of the bus.
It doesn't matter which way the voters try to turn the wheel. The bus is going to follow the predetermined path set by the economic elite and organized special interest groups. The illusion of control remains. We still have elections, we still have debates, but the actual direction of the legislation is dictated by organizations like ALEs.
It's a profoundly sobering thought. But the video argues that owning the politicians was only part of the master plan. Changing the laws wasn't enough. To truly solidify their power, the corporate elite needed to change the very culture of business itself.
Right.
They needed the public to abandon the old idea of the American dream and embrace something much colder. Which brings us to the next massive shift: financialization and the greed is good culture of the 1980s.
The text highlights a profound tectonic shift in the psychological makeup and the operational philosophy of the American CEO. It contrasts the corporate leaders of the mid-20th century with those who took over in the 1980s and defined the modern era.
Let's look at the old model first, just to see how drastic the change was. Before the 1980s, the text notes, the CEO of a major successful company earned about 30 times the salary of their average worker.
30 times.
Now, 30 times is still a lot of money. They were wealthy, but it kept them in the same basic economic stratosphere. The video points out that these old CEOs usually lived in the same town, or at least the same region, as their main factories. Their kids likely went to the same local public or private schools as the mid-level managers' kids.
It was viewed on some level as a shared enterprise. The goal of the mid-century CEO wasn't just to extract maximum immediate quarterly profit to build a personal trust fund and exit. The goal was sustainability, building a company that would thrive for generations, a stable pillar of the community, a place where their own children might want to work someday. And crucially, as the documentary points out, these older CEOs deeply wanted the community to like them.
Right, they felt a sense of civic duty, or at least a strong PR obligation to be seen as good citizens. The text mentions Macy's putting on massive Thanksgiving Day parades and fireworks, or major manufacturing corporations making huge, highly publicized contributions to build local hospitals or fund Little League teams. They needed the workers and the customers to look at them and see a friend of the community.
But the modern CEO, the archetype born in the fires of the 1980s deregulation, operates under a completely different paradigm.
Totally different.
The text notes that today, a CEO makes hundreds, sometimes thousands of times more than the average worker. They don't live anywhere near the factories. The factories have likely been moved to Mexico or China anyway. They live in an entirely different world, flying private, isolated from the consequences of their decisions.
And the video describes their worldview in incredibly stark terms. To these new CEOs, winning means setting yourself completely apart from the company and the community. The text says they view their own employees and their customers not as partners, but as peasants or suckers to be exploited.
It's a harsh word, peasants, but that's how it's described.
The only relationship that actually matters to them, the only constituency they answer to, is the relationship with the shareholders and the board of directors.
To illustrate this dramatic pivot from the old way to the new way, the documentary focuses heavily on a very specific figure, Jack Welch, who took over the reins of General Electric, or GE, in 1981.
Jack Welch. The text notes he was originally trained as a chemical engineer, and he takes the helm of GE, which at the time was one of the most trusted, iconic household names in America.
Oh, we bring good things to life, right? That was their slogan.
Yeah.
They made things. They made light bulbs. They made jet engines. They made washing machines.
But Welch brought a radically new philosophy to GE, a concept the video identifies as financialization. The text uses a brilliant, very clear analogy involving a washing machine to explain exactly how this shift works.
Yes, I love this analogy because it grounds a very abstract economic concept. Let's really unpack the washing machine.
Go for it.
In the old model, GE wants to make a profit. So they make a washing machine. To do that, they have to buy raw metal, they have to buy glass, they have to hire American workers, they have to pay for those workers' health insurance and pensions, they have to maintain a massive physical factory, and they have to deal with environmental regulations.
It's a lot of overhead. Finally, they sell the machine, and they make a small, hard-earned profit margin on that physical product. It's a productive industry. It creates jobs and tangible value.
But Welch realized that making things is difficult. It's messy. And the profit margins are tight. The video explains his realization. GE could actually make significantly more money with far less effort by lending a consumer the money to buy the washing machine than they could by actually manufacturing the machine itself.
Because when you lend money, you aren't dealing with metal or glass or factory workers or union disputes. You are just moving numbers on a digital ledger. You're extending credit and collecting pure interest.
Exactly. That is the essence of financialization. It is the shift away from producing tangible goods and providing real-world services and moving toward manipulating money, credit, and debt for profit. The text notes that under Welch's influence, the consensus on Wall Street shifted dramatically. Anyone actually making a physical product was playing a sucker's game.
A sucker's game.
The real, pure, effortless money was in financial services. GE Capital eventually became the massive profit engine of the company, effectively turning a manufacturing giant into a massive, unregulated bank.
And the human fallout from this mindset shift was brutal. The video says Welch began selling off GE's productive assets and started aggressively sending American manufacturing jobs overseas where labor was cheaper. He instituted a corporate culture that the text calls a brutally honest meritocracy.
Which is, of course, a sanitized corporate term for ruthlessly firing people.
Right.
The video notes he became infamous really, for routinely firing the bottom 10% of his entire workforce every single year, regardless of absolute performance. This earned him the chilling nickname Neutron Jack, like a neutron bomb that kills all the people but leaves the buildings intact.
Wow.
The singular goal, by any means necessary, was to get the stock value up. If a company produced absolutely nothing of tangible value, but the stock price rose due to financial engineering, that was considered a massive, unmitigated success.
And the crazy part is, as the text points out, these CEOs who were dismantling the backbone of American industry, gutting towns and firing thousands of workers, weren't treated as villains by the media. They were greeted like corporate heroes.
They really were.
They were celebrated on magazine covers like movie stars. The 1980s birthed this breathless, almost religious adoration for the ultra-wealthy.
The documentary links this directly to a broader cultural shift. It references the explosion of television shows that glorified this exact lifestyle. Shows like Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous and Dallas. There was a newly engineered national obsession with extreme, unapologetic affluence.
And we have to talk about the movie Wall Street. It's the cultural touchstone for this era. The text brings up Michael Douglas's iconic character, Gordon Gekko, and his famous defining monologue. Greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works.
An iconic line.
The video points out this terrifying detail. When that movie played in theaters in 1987, particularly in places like the Upper East Side of Manhattan, audiences were actually standing up and cheering that speech. Gekko was written to be the ultimate villain, a cautionary tale, but a massive segment of the culture embraced him as the hero, the ultimate winner.
But while the elite were celebrating greed and moving numbers on ledgers, what was happening to the average American worker? The text notes the grim reality. Wages for the working and middle class began to severely flatline. The minimum wage stagnated. The old, dependable job security disappeared entirely as the productive base of the economy was hollowed out and shipped overseas.
So this is the crux of the issue. If wages are flat and jobs are less secure, how did average people keep buying things? How did they afford to participate in the lifestyles of the rich and famous dream they were being sold on TV every night?
The video gives us the two magical, dangerous words of the 1980s. Charge it.
The illusion of a booming, affluent middle class was maintained not by rising wages, but through a massive explosion of consumer debt. And here we see the political shadow campaign that we discussed earlier, perfectly intersecting with the economic shift.
It all comes together.
The text notes that political groups like ALEC lobbied aggressively at the state and federal level to deregulate the credit card industry. They specifically worked to remove ancient legal limits, usury laws, on the interest rates that banks could charge consumers.
It was an incredible trap. As the corporate elites flatlined workers' wages, they turned around and sold the public the dream of credit to make up the difference. The video states that within a span of about 25 years, the average American's personal debt quadrupled. We replaced actual wage-driven prosperity with a fragile system built on systemic poverty that was maxed by high-interest credit card debt.
It's a house of cards.
The old mid-century bargain that if you worked hard making valuable products, you would have a decent, stable life was entirely broken.
And this brings us to the final and perhaps most visually chilling section of our deep dive. The video moves away from these abstract financial concepts, away from the jurettes and the Skinner boxes, and takes us to a physical place to show us the undeniable devastation this ideology causes on the ground. It takes us to Detroit, Michigan.
Detroit. The text reminds us of what Detroit used to be. Just half a century ago, this was the richest city in the world. It was the absolute spiritual, mechanical, and financial center of the country, the world on wheels.
Cars built Detroit.
And Detroit drove America's massive post-war prosperity. It was the ultimate example of a physical, productive economy.
But the text presents a grim, heartbreaking contrast with the Detroit of today. The city is described as a shell of its former self. The population has plummeted catastrophically, from a peak of nearly 2 million people down to roughly 650,000. It describes a post-apocalyptic landscape with enough empty, overgrown lots to fit all of Manhattan, Boston, and San Francisco combined.
The video features a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist named Charlie LaDuff, who brings a very raw, very angry local perspective. Now, LaDuff is honest. He admits that a lot of complex factors hurt Detroit over the decades. Management greed, union corruption, deep-seated racial tensions, and white flight, the pressures of globalization.
Sure.
But he points to one specific massive force that came in at the end and pushed the weakened city over the edge into total catastrophic collapse: Wall Street.
The text focuses on the role of a specific financial institution deeply tied to the city, Quicken Loans, founded by a Detroit businessman named Dan Gilbert. Throughout the 2000s, Quicken Loans grew exponentially into the largest online mortgage lender in America. And when the massive global financial meltdown hit in 2007 and 2008, Detroit was ground zero for the destruction.
The text reveals a terrifying statistic that perfectly illustrates the predatory nature of financialization. It states that at the height of the bubble, nearly 3/4 of all mortgages in Detroit were subprime.
Now, we hear the word subprime thrown around a lot. Let's do another ELI 5. What actually makes a mortgage subprime, and why is it so toxic?
A subprime mortgage is a loan given to someone who, under traditional banking rules, does not have the credit score or the verifiable income to actually pay the loan back. These were often called NINJA loans, no income, no job, or assets.
Wow.
The lenders would offer these highly risky loans with low initial teaser rates that would suddenly explode into massive payments a few years later.
But why would a bank lend hundreds of thousands of dollars to someone they know can't pay it back? That seems like terrible business.
Because of the financialization trick called bundling, the banks didn't hold on to these bad loans. The video describes how Wall Street took thousands of these toxic, doomed loans, calling them pigs, and bundled them together into complex financial instruments called mortgage-backed securities.
Oh, man.
They put a bunch of rotten apples in a box, convinced the rating agencies to slap an A-grade sticker on the box, and sold them to investors all over the world. The lenders got their fees up front, passing the risk entirely onto the global system. They were literally writing mortgages for dead people, for non-existent people, just to generate more paper to bundle and sell.
And when those teaser rates exploded and the borrowers inevitably defaulted, the housing bubble burst. The devastation in Detroit was absolute. The text notes that a random sample of mortgages originated by Quicken Loans showed that half of them went completely belly up. The physical reality of those bad numbers on a Wall Street ledger manifested as stripped, burned out, or squatter-occupied homes spreading like a virus across the entire city. Neighborhoods were wiped out.
But here is the bitter and raging irony that the video highlights. The working-class borrowers lost their homes, their credit was destroyed, their neighborhoods were decimated. But the financial institutions that engineered the crisis...
What happened to them?
The text states that the Justice Department eventually settled its case with Quicken Loans. The company paid a fine, but crucially, they never had to admit to any legal wrongdoing. Quicken not only survived the catastrophic crash it helped cause, it thrived. It went public with a massive multi-billion-dollar IPO, and Dan Gilbert became the 17th richest person in America.
And the extraction didn't stop with the crash. The text details the immediate aftermath. With the city financially decimated and property values at absolute rock bottom, Gilbert used his massive wealth to take advantage of the ultimate fire sale. The video says he spent billions buying up nearly 100 properties in downtown Detroit. He essentially bought the entire commercial core of a major American city at a massive discount.
And this is where the documentary seamlessly ties the story of Detroit back to the tax loopholes we discussed at the very beginning of the deep dive. Remember our strict neutrality disclaimer. We are simply reporting the documentary's analysis here. The text focuses on a specific piece of legislation passed under the Trump administration in 2017.
Yes, the 2017 Opportunity Zone tax break. The video notes that this policy was heavily sold to the American public as a way to attract much-needed investment and revitalize poor, struggling communities. But the argument presented by the documentary is that in reality, it functioned as a massive customized loophole for billionaires like Gilbert, who had notably donated heavily to political funds to avoid even more taxes.
The video claims that Gilbert and other billionaires utilized this specific loophole to sink billions of dollars into building gleaming, empty luxury office towers and apartments in the newly owned downtown Detroit, reaping massive multi-million-dollar tax benefits for doing so. Meanwhile, they entirely ignored the 20 square miles of surrounding neighborhoods, predominantly black, working-class areas, that were still grappling with intense poverty, crime, and the fallout of the foreclosure crisis.
This stark juxtaposition leads the documentary to its most profound and, frankly, unsettling theoretical question. What happens to a society when the wealthy have finally gutted everything? When they have externalized all the costs, outsourced the jobs, and bought up the distressed properties? When there's nothing left to take from the physical, productive economy?
This raises an important question. The video contrasts the Detroit of the 1950s with modern megacities to illustrate this final point. In the 50s, Detroit built beautiful, ornate banks and grand theaters because the wealth, while unevenly distributed, was at least based in physical reality. They were making actual cars that actual people bought. But today, the video argues, we have transitioned into an entirely abstracted economy.
The text uses the ultra-luxury, needle-thin skyscrapers of New York City as the prime example of this terrifying abstraction. It points out that these massive, bizarre towers sprouting up along Billionaires Row aren't actually homes. People don't really live in them. They are completely dark at night.
The video calls them empty boxes that represent $100 million or $150 million. They aren't meant for habitation. They are treated precisely like bonds or stock certificates. They are safe deposit boxes in the sky for oligarchs and billionaires from all over the world to park their untaxed wealth.
Safe deposit boxes in the sky.
It's a haunting, evocative image. The text says these towers are literally extracting the foundational value out of the city itself and removing it up into the sky. It describes this abstracted wealth as gas bubbles. It's trapped, it's floating away out of reach, and it isn't real in any way that benefits the society on the ground.
Which brings us to the ultimate conclusion of our deep dive, the final brutal tab that society is left to pay. The video lays out the reality for the average person listening to this right now.
The text brilliantly summarizes the squeeze the average American is under. If you are an average middle or working class citizen, you are likely already paying roughly 20% of your income in various taxes. And simultaneously, your costs for basic human survival, childcare, higher education, out-of-pocket healthcare have skyrocketed by thousands of percent over the last few decades. The average American is literally dying in debt just trying to maintain the baseline.
And while the working class faithfully pays that 20%, the text forcefully reminds us that the world's most valuable corporations like Amazon and the richest individuals like Bezos and Musk are legally utilizing the wealth defense industry to pay zero. Yet the dominant public narrative continually insists that if we want a functioning society, if we want roads or schools, the taxes on the working class must rise because the government is supposedly out of money.
The video argues that the average person is completely mathematically justified to look at that system and think it's crazy. They don't have the money to pay more taxes because they are living on the ragged edge. And they are living on the edge, the text asserts, not because of personal failure, but because the wealthy actively, systematically conspired through groups like ALEC and the Powell memo to rig the system exactly that way.
The source material ends with a stark, dire warning about the ultimate danger of this relentless extraction model. It asks a highly logical question. If the corporate elite take all the money off the table, how can they continue to earn?
If you make your customers too poor to buy your products, and you make your employees too poor and uneducated to do the work, the entire economic ecosystem eventually collapses on itself. A parasite cannot survive if it completely drains the host. The video concludes with a powerful, chilling statement. The elite are now doing to America what they historically used to do to developing nations in Central America and Africa. They are systematically strip mining their own country.
It is a heavy, complex, intensely challenging analysis of how power, legislation, and financial abstraction intersect to reshape the world we live in. We have covered a massive amount of ground today, from the bizarre world of the double Irish tax loophole to the Skinner box of Congress, all the way to the empty skyscrapers extracting wealth into the sky above New York.
I really covered a lot.
So what does this all mean? As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final provocative thought to mull over, building on what we've unpacked today. The source material shows us clearly how our physical assets, our homes in places like Detroit, our manufacturing jobs, our very cities, were turned into abstracted financial instruments to extract wealth. If our physical reality has already been mined to its absolute limits, what is the next frontier they will try to financialize and extract?
That is the question.
As we move deeper into the digital age, could it be our personal data, our time, or even the very span of our attention that becomes the next subprime mortgage? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, keep asking the hard questions, and keep examining the systems around you.